Hey everybody, this is Will Kern, Manager of Customer Energy Integration in Massachusetts for National Grid. We appreciate everybody calling in to this first WebEx that we're running. The topic today is going to be net metering. So we have Tim Rowan, who is the Director of Regulatory Strategy here at National Grid, who will run through a slide deck with quite a bit of information to share with everybody. On the WebEx, there is a chat function. If you have questions, please feel free during the presentation to submit those questions. We do have someone monitoring those questions, and we can bring them up at the end of the meeting. But we would like to hold all questions until Tim has completed his portion of the presentation here. So again, appreciate everybody calling in, and we'll get going. I'll introduce Tim.
Great, thanks, Will. As Will mentioned, Tim Rowan from the regulatory group at National Grid, been involved with DG issues for quite a number of years at the company. And as folks who've been around in the business for a while know, there's been a lot of changes around net metering and how it's managed here in Massachusetts, which is fairly different than most other states where you may or may not have done business here. So we'll go through the deck here, try to get through in 15 or 20 minutes so we can leave as many questions as possible. I think generic questions are probably better for the larger crowd. If there's specific questions, we can try to handle some of those later on, but they get a little more difficult and we may not have the proper information in front of us for any specific question. But to get started here, the agenda here is we're going to talk to net metering and the program in general, the processes behind it, how to allocate credits, a couple of new rules that are out there based on some recent orders from the Department of Public Utilities, and then obviously at the end we'll have a Q&A. Yeah. So let's get started with just the basic introduction to Massachusetts net metering. To the first slide here. In the state of Massachusetts, obviously you've got some projects that need a cap allocation and some that don't. The first bullet here talks to the small projects that are exempt from needing a cap allocation. Those are 10 kilowatts or less single-phase inverters connected to a single-phase distribution system outside the building, and or a 25 kilowatt or less three-phase inverter system that there's three-phase distribution in front of the building. Those are the two exempt categories. Anything larger than that needs to be submitted to the system of assurance through the Mass ACA, and there's a website and emails there. There's a determination of whether you're looking for a public or private cap, and this talks to the fact that if you want to get into the public cap, you do have to be certified by the Department of Public Utilities, and on their website there's a form that you can fill out to do so. Now, just as an overall discussion, as most folks are aware, the National Grid's caps in the state of Massachusetts on public and private are full. However, there are waiting lists, and because projects that currently have a cap allocation, they run into some difficulty and or don't meet certain milestones, they actually lose their cap allocation, and then that capacity becomes available for projects on the waiting list. And there's actually quite a bit of churn on that waiting list is our experience. So even though there's no more cap space, in point of fact, if you're looking for a 100 or 200 kilowatt project and you're on the waiting list, you may surprisingly get into and get a cap allocation. And again, depending on the volume, that may happen quickly, may take some time, but just because there's no cap space doesn't mean you may not be able to get a cap allocation. And as many folks who look at the website know, there's a running total of the cap of the different utilities and where they are in the cap. And you know that our colleagues over at Eversource East and West, the old Western Mass Electric and the old NSTAR Electric, do have capacity available. I'm sorry, Eversource East, NSTAR Electric does have significant amounts of capacity left. So there's plenty of opportunity in other parts of the state to get into the system of assurance and get cap allocation. So next slide we'll go to under the higher level basics. One of the requirements that the National Grid has under the net metering programs is as soon as practical, once we get an interconnection application, we have to determine the eligibility or not of that application. And there's a specific single parcel rule, a single net metering facility on a parcel of land. And farther in the webinar, we'll get into some of the potential exemptions from that, which the Mass DPU just issued orders recently about. But essentially, you can only have a single project on a single parcel, and it's limited to 2 megawatts for private entities, and or if it's a public entity, you're limited to 10 megawatts. And that, technically for public entities, it's 10 megawatts statewide. So there are specific subdivision restrictions as to when you can change parcels of land. Specifically, this states clearly that any subdivisions done after January 1, 2010 are still considered a single parcel as they were as of January 10, 2010, January 1st, 2010. And it was all about gaming way back when these were first put in place in 2010. We would get multiple 1 megawatt projects proposed on a single parcel of land. And as there's various levels of net metering credits, and those projects got higher credits than if you had a single project of 2 megawatts on the property. And it was enacted to prevent the gaming that was occurring at the time, something that the DPU specifically wanted to address at that point in time. Next slide, please. Now just as a sidebar, we are muting, but apparently sometimes it doesn't work so well. So please put your phones on mute until the question and answer session begins, so that we don't interrupt other folks on the webinar. Thank you for muting. So once you're either cap exempt for those smaller projects, or you've got a cap allocation. In terms of how you allocate those credits, you've got 3 options. You can keep them on the account where the net metering facility is located. You can keep some of it on that one account and allocate some of it, or you can allocate all the credits generated at a net metering facility to other accounts. And that's done through the use of our Schedule Z, where you tell us which of those 3 options you want. And if you're looking to allocate credits, then you have to detail which account, what percentage of the monthly credits that are created are allocated to each account. To make this simpler and more consistent, the department, as part of their recent order, also requires this Excel spreadsheet that some of you who've worked with us for a number of years have seen. A similar document. We've used one for a number of years to ease the problems for ourselves and our customers anyway. And again, that's how you'll fill out Schedule Z. Double check the math, double check the account numbers. There can be significant delays in net metering credits being issued and allocated if the account numbers aren't correct, or if the percentages don't add up to 100%. And you've got to understand the series of accounts you're looking to allocate to, so that you're always allocating the proper percentages on an annual basis. Obviously, we know it varies month to month in terms of what people are paid, but the percent of the credits earned in each month at the net metering facility are identical month to month. Obviously, the values change over time. So the other thing you need to make sure your customers are aware of is that it's not a fixed credit per month. It varies by the actual solar production on a month-by-month basis. So that's Schedule Z. So there are a couple of new exemptions that the Department of Public Utilities put into place. And one of those is for systems on rooftops, where you can specifically cap exempt facilities. Again, the small 10 kilowatt on a single-phase circuit or 25 kilowatt on a three-phase circuit. The total nameplate has to remain below either of those numbers that are applicable to your facility. And again, if you don't know if it's a single-phase or three-phase circuit in front of you, there is a pre-application, a report that any entity can get in the interconnection tariff, and there's a form and an email address in the tariff so you can do that and figure out what you're in front of. But so you are allowed to have multiple projects. We'll get into how that exemption actually works, because it is an exemption that the DPU, the Department of Public Utilities, has to issue. It's not an exemption that National Grid can do. So they need to be tied behind the service entrance of wherever building they're in, and they each have to have a separate metered point in order to be eligible. The other exemption is for multiple types of eligible net metering technology types, which are solar, wind, anaerobic digestion. We're not addressing small hydro. That's a new net metering category, but those are relatively rare, and a lot of this doesn't apply to those. But in terms of this, again, they need to be separately metered. They can be and again, you're either in the private or in the public. You cannot have projects in the private and the public on the same parcel. They're all the same. And in any event, the maximum capacity is still the 2 megawatt number for the private entities and the 10 megawatt number for the public entities. So those are the two exceptions that the department put out there. The next slide talks to how that's going to work. Just a note about the small hydro. There is a term called agricultural net metering. It's not really a separate technology because it's either solar, wind, or anaerobic digesters, right? And obviously, even if you had a grandfathered facility of 15 years ago, these still apply. So if your grandfather project was 8 kilowatts and you want to add 5, well, it's not cap exempt anymore because you'll be over the 10. So that's an important note that you need to understand. So the process here is that the host customer, which is the customer, typically the account holder, the name of the account holder where the net metering facility exists, has to complete a form, and the link is here. These slides will be available after the presentation. So you can go to the link. The department will then process it, and depending what they do, if it's granted, they'll provide that copy of it to us, the company, the utility company, and the Mass System Assurance or ACA administrator, again, if it needs a cap allocation. Now, if, for example, the blanket exception isn't simply a different technology or is above the cap exempt sizes, the department can always issue an exception if there's a specific petition that a customer sends into the department, and they may or may not approve that. But again, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, it is either the department who tells us that someone's eligible for net metering, or the system administrator who tells us we're eligible for net metering if they're larger than the cap exempt facilities. The company does not make that determination, and we need proof of cap allocation in order to get the net metering if you need a cap allocation. So the next slide talks about the aggregation of capacity. If you're granted an exception, if you recall, the net metering credits are either the Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3, the difference being Class 3 doesn't get the distribution credit per kilowatt hour. And what this is talking to is that the total capacity of the net metering facilities will be aggregated on a single parcel to calculate the net metering credit. So in other words, if you've got a 600 kilowatt wind turbine on your parcel of land, you're getting paid under the Class 2 credits. If you then apply for a separate 700 kilowatt solar array, the 700 plus the 650 is 1,350 kilowatts, and it sticks you into the Class 2 calculation of, the Class 3 calculation of credits, which is a different value of credits. And you need to understand that going in, because if you've been getting, call it a 15-cent net metering credit, and you go from Class 2 to Class 3, that 15-cent credit will drop because you lose the distribution component. Even under the new market net metering rules that are out there, it still reduces the total cost. And you need to understand that in your economics if you're going to look for multiple technologies on the same parcel of land. So that's the basics of net metering. The newer rules that are out there, summary is pretty straightforward. You need to have a Schedule Z no matter what with net metering. We would like to see that as soon as possible. Surprisingly, we get many Schedule Zs filled out incorrectly, and it takes a lot of time and effort to go back and fix those. And obviously, we don't realize that until we start to try to allocate credits. I mean, as you can imagine, there's a lot of interest in net metering in Massachusetts. There's about 2,000 megawatts connected in Massachusetts already, and so there's a lot of customers doing this already, and more to come every day. Because even though our caps are full at National Grid, as I said, the waiting list allows more in, but there's also projects that have had cap allocations for some time that are now just getting online and just starting to allocate credits. So it's really important the Schedule Z is filled out properly. The other challenge with the Schedule Z is that it can take upwards of 3 months for credits to actually start being allocated to the various accounts due to a number of issues, primarily being when each individual account was typically billed in the past, because that bill date is still the same. But if you've got customers who are billed on the first of the month and customers billed on the last of the month, usually, you need all those bills to kind of go through their cycle before the credits will start to pop up on bills folks see. If you do set up an account online for National Grid, which you can do on our website, you'll see those credits when they're applied to the account immediately. But if you're waiting for an actual bill to be mailed to you, you'll see it when that next bill finally comes out. So be patient. Once the credits start coming, it's pretty much automatic, and they'll continue to come. But that first couple of months is something that folks have to get through. The other critical thing here is that the larger projects, 60 kilowatts and larger, we do need to offset the cost of net metering. This year we'll pay about $70 million in net metering credits to customers this calendar year alone. And those are obviously borne by all other customers. So what we are also required to do is set up energy assets at the ISO New England and sell that power at a wholesale price so that we can reduce that impact on all of the customers. So if we're paying a net metering credit of 18 cents a kilowatt hour and the wholesale price is 3 cents, all of the customers only pay the 15-cent differential, and that's something that's been in place for quite some time. So that's why those are required. So, and there's specific metering requirements. And depending on the size of the project, there's other challenges, and especially depending on the size of your individual project, plus other large projects in the immediate area, there's other significant ISO-related issues that have to be addressed prior to being given the authority to interconnect and operate in parallel with the system. But that's the summary of the deck in front of us here, and the resources we have showing the various orders. I mean, it's important for folks to understand that it's actually your responsibility to understand how the regulations work. National Grid and the various mass utilities have their interpretation that we deem to be correct, but it's also your responsibility to make sure you understand these rules and regulations. And that takes some time. There's been a lot of various orders, petitions to the department, so it's important that you take the time to understand those clearly. From the small capped exempt customers under 10 kilowatt single phase, et cetera, a lot of these really don't affect you significantly, but it's still important that you know what these mean and what they and get some legal advice if need be or what have you. So those are the resources available, and I think we'll now look at some questions that folks may have and try to work through. Do we just show the questions on the screen and then
yeah.
Try.
A couple questions here.
So we got a couple questions here. Does the webinar pertain to New York at all? No, not at all. Rhode Island at all? No, not at all. Can a QF customer and net metering customer on the same parcel? Yes, as long as the net metering customer and, as the question specifically talks to, as long as they have to be separately metered and separate accounts as well here at the company. But yes, you can have and for folks who aren't familiar with the term QF, it's actually acronym for qualifying facility. It's actually the original way customer-owned generation was reimbursed for excess energy, and but it was always just at what we call the avoided cost or the wholesale pricing, which, as I already mentioned, is only in the 3 or 4 cent range for solar. When solar is operating, the high wholesale prices in the winter are typically not when solar systems are operating. So at the end of that's what qualifying facilities mean. But, you know, back a few years ago, people would size their solar arrays on a generation, on a coincident basis of generation to actually load, so they wouldn't have any significant export in any hour of the day, and they would use it all on site. If you had a 500 kilowatt load at a customer and you had a 200 kilowatt solar array, except for sometimes on the weekends, you would get very minimal export, and you displace the electricity you normally buy from the electric distribution companies, and so that's the value of that, whatever your average cost per kilowatt hour was. So at the end of the day, this is just another way that you can get reimbursed. But again, just because you can't get a net metering cap doesn't mean solar doesn't make good economic sense for lots of customers. And so it's important you do that real hourly coincidence analysis of generation to load. if you can. So there are plans for the net metering caps to be raised. There was that conversation in the legislature a couple of months back. The legislators have determined it wasn't needed. There's plenty of cap space left, as I said, in the state of Massachusetts. National Grid has many more projects that are getting net metering credits than Eversource does. And so it's frankly blatantly unfair for the National Grid Massachusetts customers to be paying more for solar policy in the state of Massachusetts than our neighbors who have Eversource as their utility. And so, I mean, everyone needs to pay their fair share for solar policy issues. Solar canopies are, I think a solar canopy is a rooftop. Yeah, I think there's obviously that's a rooftop exemption, but I think it's clear though, again, it's not a rooftop exemption, it's a rooftop cap exempt exception. So that's critical, and as long as your solar canopy is only 5 kilowatts and the array on your house is 5 kilowatts, that's fine, right? But it won't work if you've got 5 kilowatts on your roof and you want to put 25 kilowatts on your solar canopy. You can't, because now the total is higher than the cap exempt numbers. I also already said this isn't about Rhode Island, so I'll pass on that one. Look at the next question related to SMART. SMART is a separately metered generation facility. It's not behind the load customer, right? That's the key difference between net metering in general and SMART in general. SMART is not behind the load, or can physically be there, but it's metered as if it's a separate standalone system. The next question on the single parcel rule, it really was immaterial of what National Grid thought. It was actually specifically something the department saw quickly as gaming, and they took strides to reduce that level of gaming. Again, we're a regulated entity. You know, the Department of Public Utilities oversees all of our rules and regulations, and we are obligated to follow those. If we want to do something different, we, just like any customer, has to petition the department for that change if indeed we look to do it. So, read the question. It was not gaming. Well, I'm not going to go there, and we'll just leave that be. So those are the questions in the chat. Oops, maybe we're still getting them. So, yeah, I guess you know, we're not sure where. It's a question about SMART. Obviously, this is a net metering seminar, not a SMART seminar. The department still has that docket open, so none of us actually know what SMART's going to be. We propose something. Who knows what they'll actually say? So I'm going to pass on the SMART question. Work requests, expediting work requests for new services. That's standard work. We process thousands of those a year, and folks are in the queue and they get processed as they get processed. Apologies. One meter, one parcel rule work if you're connecting to multiple dwelling units on a common property. Well, again, the common property is a single parcel, so you only can have the single net metering facility on that single parcel of land unless you get either one of the blanket exceptions the department's talked to, or you petition separately to the department directly. So that's the chat from the webinar. We'll open up the phone line for additional questions for folks if they have them.
They can just unmute themselves.
So just remember to unmute yourself. I think we've unmuted the system. Is that correct? Excellent. Any questions from the phone?
And I just,
Oh, there we go.
you like? Yes. All right, what? Oh, bro.
I can't, well, if someone's asking the question, I can't really hear it.
Heads up.
All right, doesn't sound like there's questions on the phone. At this point, we're, thank you.
Oh, wait,
Oh, one more. Are the net metering credits allocated 100% of the on-site generation? I guess I would assume this is saying, yes, every month, whatever the credits are calculated at the net metering facility are allocated as per the Schedule Z that you provided to us. And since it has to add up to 100%, we do allocate 100% of those credits to the accounts as per the percentages you indicated on your Schedule Z. And yeah, the deck will be available as part of the webinar, and so you can look at it at your leisure. All right, with that said, no more questions. Appreciate everyone's time and energy.